and welcome to the program. The Ukrainian parliament has recently adopted a bill to effectively introduce more NATO standards in the military. This allows the Ministry of Defense to develop and adopt a framework per NATO standards within the Ukrainian legislation. This is seen as an important step. To talk more about this, we're joined by retired Major General Volodymyr Havrylov. He's the curator of Marine Corps Marathon in Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Nice to meet you.
So, over the past few years, we've heard statements from top Ukrainian commanders who spoke about how Ukraine is moving towards NATO standards. And only recently, and in February, the Ukrainian parliament will finally pass a bill on NATO standards in the Ukrainian military. Why has it taken so long, do you think?
Oh, first of all, sooner or later we have to follow our obligations with our partners in Europe and United States, with NATO partners, and because we declared our goal, our purpose to join the NATO sooner or later, it means we have to do our homework. And one of the homework is standardization of our military. Unfortunately, maybe it took a long time because we were in war. I can understand it. So 4 years, all our military were concentrated on the current, up to the day challenges, not maybe concentrating enough on strategic long-term things to be done. But now we have been in a situation that we have to start a more systemic approach to that. And military standards, especially in our military of the armed forces, is a challenge. It's a challenge. It's not because it's very tough to do in terms of documentation or procedures. We can approve, change a lot of papers. It's not a problem. The problem is to change the mindset of people who are working in the headquarters, first of all, commanders of the units. It takes time. You can't change a person immediately from one, let it be so, understanding of the world to another. It's a generation challenge.
Right, and it's sort of a mindset that a lot of these Ukrainian top commanders even have. When I was speaking to some of the Canadian and American military personnel who are working to train Ukrainian soldiers here in Western Ukraine, this was one of the main things that I think was mentioned. The changing people's perceptions and changing people's mindsets and how the military should really work. But how does that fit into the strategy of interoperability? How does that fit into the strategy of the objective of achieving interoperability with NATO forces by 2020? And that's what Ukraine pledged to do in 2016. So how does changing a mindset by 2020 of all these top commanders, how will that actually work? Is this even realistic?
Be honest, it's not possible to do it by 2020 in terms of changing mindset. By 2020, we are able to change all necessary documentation, papers, manuals. We can introduce some procedures in planning and training. We also can change some technical related to manufacturing of military equipment. But to change people, we can't replace, we don't have other people, we have people what we have. But we have to have very clear understanding how we can do it in a medium perspective and maybe long-term perspective. We have to start with youngsters. We have to start with cadets. We have to start with young officers. We have to change our system of training and education, first of all, because it still has a lot of Soviet-type approaches and methods. And only that generation, a young generation, which is more adaptive to any changes, they will be a real culture change in the future armed forces of Ukraine. So the current generation, all we can do is just to change, let it say, material paperwork. So we have chance and opportunity to prepare the next young generation to work with a real clear understanding what is NATO standards about and how to do it.
Right.
But we have to do a lot in
allies.
training and education of young generation of future military. That is a challenge. And we have to put right people in right places in all our leadership positions.
But of course, all the top military command now, these are men in their 50s, in their 60s, perhaps some of them. These are men who were in the military during Soviet times. So how do you help them change, and how do you help them to kind of adopt the new standards?
I think for them, the main mission is not to create obstacles and not to slow down the process, just to encourage next generation to do it in the right way. But at the same time, our country leadership, national leadership, they have to understand that we have to replace as soon as possible the key positions in the armed forces, in the Ministry of Defense, with the people who've got some education and training in NATO-related colleges and institutions in Europe and United States. We have programs with United States and NATO for training our commanders, quite experienced commanders after 4 years of war. And every year we have a number of them in universities, military institutions in the United States and Europe. And it's just a key task, a key mission of our national leadership to select people for that kind of training and to use them immediately in key positions in the Ministry of Defense and the armed forces.
Of course.
Because only that kind of people...
Can I just interrupt you for a second there? You are a career military personnel. You've served as part of the mission in the U.S. I think you mentioned this before the interview, and you have extensive background, extensive knowledge of how the military works in the U.S. As you mentioned before the interview, you worked in the Pentagon. How do you see how do you see the Ukrainian military adopting these new standards and standards that you know about in the near future, considering the losses in the war in the East and considering the experience that Ukraine has already had?
Well, nevertheless, we have a new generation coming into the military activities. Young generation. I mean, not youngsters, just 30 years old, 40 years old officers, major lieutenant colonels. They are really and they really want to take new knowledge. They really understand that is a need for a new military. They witness themselves the weaknesses of our military during the war, related to communication, planning, logistics especially. And they know there are solutions and ideas and good practices in NATO and other countries, how to do it in the right way. So they are just would like to do it. So once again, it's only a matter of motivation of the leadership. It's only a matter of desire of commanders and leaders.
And do you think there is a desire?
I'm sometimes confused. To be honest, because there are good declarations. At the same time, we see what we see. So after 4 years of war, we're only just close to the NATO standards in terms of legislation.
What has Ukraine achieved in terms of NATO standards?
We achieved a lot in terms of understanding what it's all about, first of all.
Okay.
So 4 or 5 years ago, NATO standards is just something academic, just not related to real life. It's only related to joint operations somewhere in Iraq or other places. But when you have experience of a war on your territory, and when you have knowledge of not the modern, but with that kind of warfare, immediately you understand that something wrong with your concept of warfare. You have to do something in a more right way. So now there is understanding and desire in the military, motivation for changes.
And that's the most important thing, really, isn't it?
That is important, because sometimes, not sometimes, always, without motivation, you can't do any kind of reform. So now we have a motivation, we have a pressure, and I would like to say pressure from our partners to do it in the right way. And we have support in the society, we have understanding in the parliament. So we're at the beginning of this long way, but we're on the right direction.
Of course. Now, the recent Russia's recent attack on the Ukrainian Navy near the Kerch Strait that has left many NATO allies and NATO member countries voicing their concerns. But this wasn't exactly the response that the Ukrainian government may have been looking for. So what sort of response, in your opinion, would have been seen as ideal from NATO by Ukraine?
I would like to say that we've got we saw a very good response from our partners, from Europe and from United States, first of all. In Washington, they immediately understood what it's all about. There are no doubts about who is aggressor and who is a problem. And most important, we have a resolution of United Nations Assembly about Ukraine recently. This is also very important. I would like to stress that Russia also understood the mistake they've done. They can't recognize it in open because they never do it. But they understood they crossed one more red line. They started to shoot openly to our military. Before that, they always say, we never are in war with Ukraine. It's not our people there. It's only some locals and others. It was the first time. Then they started to shoot at our military in a situation which was very clear to everybody. It was in neutral waters. So the response of our partners and the United States was okay. International response on the United Nations was excellent, because now we have a paper resolution. We have two resolutions on Crimea, with confirming that that Crimea is a temporary occupied territory, and that is a good paper for any kind of international laws or courts and other trials for future.
Right, and this is kind of the first steps that we've seen so far. But there have been calls to set up a Black Sea fleet, a monitoring Black Sea fleet that would be that would have NATO member states see some of their vessels perhaps patrolling the Black Sea and near the Kerch Strait. Now, that hasn't really been voiced by any of the NATO member states, despite calls to create this.
We have to be very careful. Yeah, we have to be very careful, because Azov Sea is a special sea, it's internal sea between two countries. So they are not covered properly by international maritime.
But the Black Sea. But I mean,
in Black Sea, there is always a permanent presence of NATO navies, and for example, recently the British ship entered the region. So we have a so-called rotational force of NATO countries in the Black Sea. At the same time, the number of vessels and ships is limited, because there is an international convention, Montreal Convention, which limits the number of foreign ships in Black Sea. Nevertheless, the permanent presence of NATO ships, and also very strong support from Turkey, even this NATO country, encourages us to concentrate on our efforts on building our navy, first of all, to be able to keep Russia away from our territorial waters as minimum.
Right, and that's really the most important thing that Ukraine can hope for. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
We were joined by retired Major General Volodymyr Havrylov. He's the curator of Marine Corps Marathon in Ukraine. And you're watching UATV.